Welcome to chessopenings.com. In this video, we'll take a look at the Nimzo-Indian, which is the most popular reply to the queen's pawn opening. It begins with the moves pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn to c4, e6, knight c3, and now bishop to b4. During this video, we'll take a look at the most interesting and popular lines for both sides in the Nimzo-Indian. Let's take a look. Black's use of the pinning move bishop b4 introduces two significant hassles for white. Firstly, the bishop on b4 prevents white from stretching out in the center with this move e2 to e4, and that's because of the pin on the knight at the moment. The second factor which black is taking account of with this move bishop b4 is the threat to capture on c3 at some point and give white doubled c-pawns on the c file. Now, what are white's arguments going to be in this position? Well, first of all, he does still maintain a space advantage thanks to the duo of pawns on d4 and c4, and it's due to this factor that black will have some problems developing the remainder of his pieces. And secondly, white can still aim to advance the pawns forward at some point if black does not play carefully, so white still has a space advantage. The second factor which can work to white's favor is this possibility of gaining the bishop pair. Perhaps he'll either provoke the bishop with the move a3 either now or at some other later stage in the game and then accept the bishop pair, or he may find that black may just unprovoked capture on c3, and in both cases white will have the dark squared bishop and the light squared bishop versus a bishop and knight. And due to this, if the game opens up, suddenly the dark squared bishop could become a monster. Also, the bishop pair offers some great chances in the endgame. Today, we're going to restrict ourselves to understanding the most popular options for white, beginning with the move queen to c2. And this is known as the classical variation, or it's also sometimes called the Kappa Blanka variation. White's core idea here is to play a2 to a3, just as we talked about, and then to snatch this bishop without having to double his pawns. So he's setting the queen up for a recapture here. So for example, after the popular reply castles kingside, now pawn to a3, bishop takes knight, and queen takes bishop, and we see here that white has already gained the bishop pair. The dark squared bishop does not have a contender on the black side. And so we've reached this standard position, which is highly important and representative of some of the main issues in the Nimzo-Indian. White's capitalized on one of the most important downsides of this position. However, white has fallen a little bit behind in development. He's using his queen too actively in the opening, and the queen is vulnerable to attack. And also, white simply has not done very much to complete his development. So white knows that he needs to catch up in development, and at the same time, he's probably going to still be struggling to expand this e-pawn into the center. It's this combination of extra space and the bishop pair that white is hoping to turn into a deadly combination. A hallmark of the Nimzo-Indian, though, is its flexibility for black, and black has a development advantage here and has many different plans which he can try in this position with varying degrees of success. The most standard reply here is simply to play this move b6, followed by bishop b7, further controlling the squares along this diagonal, and at some point, perhaps attacking black in the center with this move pawn to c5, or in certain special cases, he might use the move pawn to d5, and this is one setup. Another setup which has become very popular recently, Kramnik, for example, the former world champion, has played several games in this line, is to play the move pawn to d5 here. And the idea here is simply to capture on c4. And now, black's going to use a very annoying system of development for this bishop. He's trying to bring this bishop out to a6. And at some point, black will also play for pawn to c5, and white has had big problems finding very much in this position as well, though he still has a slight advantage. So this is one more system which is sometimes used in this position. Finally, probably another more flexible system is simply for black to play d6 and now to finish his development with the moves knight d7, b6, and bishop b7, and later pawn to c5, or he may also contemplate pawn to e5. So all of these different systems, they give black a different sort of position, and they each allow him some decent chances, but white tends to have just a small initiative remaining in these positions. So backing up to the position after queen c2, black still has a couple of other ways to open up his attack on the center more quickly. He can play, for example, this move, pawn to d5. In this position, unlike the traditional queen's gambit, black already threatens to win the c4 pawn thanks to this pin on the knight. And just to give an example of how this works, if pawn takes pawn, white would normally just be able to recover this pawn fairly easily. However, in this position, the move b5 is playable thanks to this pin, and theory shows that white has big problems in trying to recover his pawn and does not have enough compensation in the center. So perhaps another logical move would be the move pawn to e3, but theory has shown also here that this is not a very good move for white, since white isn't really able to get this bishop out in this position, and the queen is a little bit misplaced here. It's not so easy for white to just play a3 and capture on c3 like he'd like to do here, because black's grip on the center is just a little bit too strong for white to now continue in this kind of fashion. And so theory shows that black tends to be more or less okay if he's combining these moves queen c2 and e3 together. So for this reason, white does not play e3. So typically, white handles this situation by playing pawn takes pawn in the center. And it might look like this gives up all of the advantage in the center. However, we have to remember that we're trading a flank pawn for a center pawn, and this yields us a 2-to-1 majority in the center. So another point is that if black recaptures with the pawn, the bishop b4 is not very well placed anymore. It looks like that bishop would rather be on e7, where it protects against the potential pin bishop to g5. So it turns out that sooner or later black may regret having played bishop b4, and this is one method for white to aim for an advantage in this situation after pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn in the center. He's got the 2-to-1 in the center, and he's trying to point out that this bishop on b4 may be misplaced. Another interesting idea that black has developed in this position is after the move pawn takes pawn, he can actually make use of the pin by capturing with the queen. And this is very interesting. The idea here is that white's queen is missing in action from her normal post on d1, and because of this, black is already threatening to play queen takes d4. And if white plays, for example, the natural pawn to e3, then we have a lot of counterplay for black after the move pawn to c5, taking down the center and creating some weaknesses. And so because of this, white tends to keep his options more open with the move knight to f3 in order to defend this d4 pawn. And now perhaps, for example, looking to play bishop d2 and start a threat on the queen. And now, quite interestingly, the key move here for black turns out to be queen to f5, a very, very interesting move in the Nimzo-Indian. And the idea here is that after the trade of queens, which white normally goes for, black has just set up a very strong grip on this e4 square, but he's done so at the cost of his structure somewhat. He has some slightly doubled pawns, but he says, look, I'm going to be able to get a decent game here, and in the meantime, you're going to have real trouble advancing the center in the way that you'd like to. And theory suggests that black is very close to having a strong equality in this position, but white, once again, has some slight initiative. Now, your head might be spinning here a little bit, as you might be thinking, wait a minute, black seems to have just way too many options in this opening. We've noticed, for example, so far we've seen an early d5, we've seen a later d5 after the exchange on c3, we've seen all kinds of different setups for black, and it's here that I want to talk about a third aspect of the Nimzo-Indian that I think is really strong for black. So far, we've shown that there's a potential to double the pawns, the c-pawns. There's also this control of the e4 square, which restrains white. But I think a third function of the Nimzo-Indian is its flexibility, that black has not placed any pawns in the center early. And because of this, he often finds himself having multiple plans to address whatever system white comes up with. Backing up to this position where we were exploring the move queen c2, White has another very popular response to the Nimzo-Indian, and that is to simply get on with development with the move pawn to e3. In this way, he shores up the d4 pawn so that it's not too vulnerable to an early c5 attack, and he prepares to develop his knight and place his bishop on d3. Black's hope is simply to grab the bishop pair at the right moment with a2 to a3, and then to later orchestrate this move e3 to e4. But he's not trying to prioritize these aims over completing development. So he's more interested in staying at par in development with black in this line. Though black can flirt with some other ideas, these days black tends to lead towards playing castling kingside, and now bishop d3, and now black typically chooses a direct occupation of the center with the move pawn to d5, knight f3, pawn to c5, castles kingside. And here black has a few options, all of which lead to very interesting strategic problems for both sides. One idea is simply to capture on c4 with d takes c4, and then to quickly proceed with development with simply this move knight b to d7. This is one idea. But the main idea is for black to simply play knight c6. This is the most popular, most standard idea. And at this point, white finally cashes in and takes the bishop pair, a3, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. And this is a standard Nimzo-Indian structure in which white has the bishop pair, and he will not have to live with the doubled c-pawns for long, since he always has the option of taking on d5, and black often takes on c4 himself in these positions. So the question here is whether or not white will eventually be able to make anything out of the dark squared bishop, or will his doubled c-pawns and black's knight turn out to be more persuasive factors in the struggle which comes up. If white can ever achieve the move e3 to e4 and bring this dark squared bishop into the game, he often wins gloriously. He often wins through fantastic attacking style or through outstanding endgames. However, if black is able to restrain this, black has excellent counter chances. Another key line, the only other line which I'm going to show here, is c takes d4. And now after pawn takes pawn, and bishop takes pawn, this would lead to the isolated queen's pawn structure, which, well, we've talked so much about this throughout the videos. The battle from here rages about whether or not white's open lines and his advanced outposts, the scope for his pieces, right? The battle here is whether or not these things fully compensate for the weakness on d4, and theory has shown that in this particular isolated queen's pawn position, black is taking serious risk, as the white d-pawn does contribute to big attacking chances for white. We've looked at a lot of the main lines of the Nimzo-Indian, and even though it seems like the strategic content is changing quite frequently, I think you'll find that there are certain concepts, certain themes of the Nimzo-Indian which don't change very often no matter what variation is being played. And some of these themes, for example, are the bishop pair, doubled c-pawns, control by black of the light squares, particularly e4, white struggling to achieve the move pawn to e4, and white struggle to bring the bishop pair to fruition. And so by studying the Nimzo-Indian, if you isolate these few things and you pay attention to how these particular factors influence the game, you can learn a considerable amount about chess in general and about the Nimzo-Indian, and I recommend this opening both with white and with black. Look forward to seeing you again, and thank you.